Within the mud flood community, there is the belief that at some point in the relatively recent past, there was a civilization reset. What was the purpose of this civilization reset? According to mud flood proponents on YouTube, it seems to have been initiated, perhaps in the 19th century, to hide the existence of the advanced, benevolent Tartarian Empire. The evil elites, whoever they actually are, got together and came up with a sinister plan to erase Tartaria from the history books. But what brilliant scheme did these evil elites devise to erase the old Tartarian world and usher in a civilization reset? The answer? Mud. Yes, that was their great plan. Use mud to partially bury all of the Tartarian buildings and yet leave them completely intact. In hindsight, it seems that it didn't occur to these evil elites that future generations might have access to things like picks and shovels, or mechanical diggers, bulldozers, ground-penetrating radar, tunnelling machines. Didn't it occur to the evil elites that one day someone might want to dig a hole? But regardless, the evil elites sent the mud flowing, or welling up from the ground, and before long, all the cities and towns across the world were partially buried in mud. And what of all the people on Earth in the 1850s during this cataclysm? What happened to them? At that time, the human population was about 1.2 billion people. Did the mud flood kill off the vast majority of people all over the Earth as a way to greatly reduce the population to then effectively manipulate and erase the memories of the survivors? Was 98% of humanity drowned in the mud flows? If so, where are they all buried? Were they given proper burials in cemeteries? Or are their remains still waiting to be exhumed from the mud flood? If this is the case, then why don't construction workers come across hundreds, even thousands of human remains every time they dig excavations for new buildings? Shouldn't bodies be showing up almost daily whenever anyone takes a shovel and digs their garden? And it's not just the remains of human and animal bodies that should constantly be found buried as a result of the mud flood. What about all the detritus of the Tartarian Empire? After all, wasn't the point of the mud flood to bury and conceal the existence of the Tartarian civilization? So why don't we find Tartarian tools, Tartarian clothing, Tartarian modes of transport, Tartarian machines, etc., mixed in with the mud and the dead bodies? And while the mud flood was affecting the land, what about remote communities and villages and those who lived in arid, mountainous and jungle communities? What about people who worked in isolated forestry and mining industries? People in prisons and distant labour camps? People at sea? What happened to them while the mud was inundating the land? International trade even back then stretched the globe, as did the journeys of ships on exploration missions. And of course, there was, as there is now, naval ships patrolling the seven seas. And what about people on small distant islands? Were all these people affected by the mud flood? If the vast majority of humanity was suddenly wiped out, several outcomes would immediately be obvious. Firstly, we would have what is called a genetic bottleneck, which is when a large population is suddenly reduced to a much smaller one with much less genetic information now available to be passed on. Is there evidence of a very recent genetic bottleneck in the genes of all people living today? No, there isn't. It would also be clear that most family surnames would instantly disappear from church records, census records, school records, government records, court records, etc., as whole family lines were suddenly wiped out. Do family names suddenly disappear en masse? No. And what about all the companies, schools and organisations that have been in existence since before the mud flood and which are still in existence today? Are all their pre-mud flood sales invoices, pay slips, inventory manifestos, attendance records, minutes of meetings, etc., all forgeries, designed to fool us into thinking that these companies and organisations are actually very old? Here's a few very old companies, schools and organisations that predate and post-date the mud flood. And what if the mud flood didn't kill off the vast majority of the human race? If this is so, how did the evil elites manage to erase everyone's memories? How did everyone completely forget that this cataclysmic and, let's be honest, bizarre mud flood event occurred? Did 1.2 billion people who witnessed the mud flood simply forget to tell their children? Did absolutely nobody think to write down what they saw? Or was everyone the victim of memory erasing technology, the likes of which have never existed then or now? At 9:40 a.m. on the 1st of November, 1755, the city of Lisbon, capital of Portugal, was hit by a massive earthquake and subsequent tsunami. The city was virtually destroyed. Why do I mention this disaster? Because people saw it happen and they wrote about it. The survivors created paintings and engravings about it. They recorded their frightening experiences in journals and letters. The event was reported in national and international newspapers. The destruction negatively affected the Portuguese economy, which took decades to recover. The event also greatly influenced Portuguese politics, European philosophy, social reform, town planning. The destruction of Lisbon was a real event, and the eyewitness accounts and documents pertaining to it are still with us today. So too are the eyewitness accounts of other catastrophic events. All of these events were observed and recorded, producing contemporary documents and visual representations. With all that in mind, how many contemporary documents, letters, drawings, journals, and eyewitness accounts exist about the so-called mud flood? The answer is none. Zero. There is literally nothing. How could such a worldwide cataclysmic event not be recorded by anyone in any way, shape or form? And when you really think about it, why did the evil elites choose to destroy this advanced Tartarian civilization and wipe everyone's memory of it in a reset? What was the point? If things were going so great for humanity, why wreck it all and create an ineffectual, even comical, cover-up involving mud? And further, why wasn't the Tartarian imperial administration powerful enough to prevent the demise of their empire? If they were so advanced and so mighty, why did they slip so easily into oblivion? Proponents of mud flood and civilization reset have no answers to any of the questions raised. When did the reset occur? They don't know. How did the reset occur? They don't know that either. Who initiated the reset? They're not sure. Where are all the victims of the mud flood buried? They don't know that either. Why do old companies carry on regardless of the mud flood and the reset? They still don't know. The belief in a civilization reset is completely and utterly unsupported by any documentary, genetic, illustrative, eyewitness, and physical evidence. There is literally nothing to support the belief.